And you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Politico reports a $2 million missile versus a $2,000 drone. The Pentagon is worried over cost of the Ansar Allah attacks in the Red Sea. Quote, that quickly becomes a problem because the most benefit is in their favor, according to one military expert. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. One of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital, Racism, and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
As American warships rack up kills against Houthi drones and missiles in the Red Sea, Pentagon officials are increasingly alarmed not just at the threat to U.S. naval forces and international shipping, but at the growing cost of keeping them safe. And a couple of things, Dr. Horne. One, it's not only Pentagon officials that are increasingly alarmed, it's maritime insurance companies, it's maritime corporations that are concerned about this. And this is nothing new, or this is nothing out of the norm. This is what happens in insurgent conflicts and guerrilla warfare. Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, this crisis that has now spread to the Red Sea as a direct outgrowth of the war crimes being committed in historic Palestine has a certain inevitability to it. What I mean by that is you have these major shipping firms, including those cited in Denmark, including those cited, quite frankly, in the United States, which routed the Union, the National Maritime Union, because it had the left-wing leadership in the United States. Speaking of the founder of that union, Ferdinand Smith, a black man of Jamaican origin. And so now they fly under flags of convenience. They don't necessarily fly under the Danish flag or the U.S. flag. They fly under the flag of Liberia or the Marshall Islands, which has converted these work sites into what are referred to as floating slums, where workers are treated shabbily, and that's a euphemism. And at the same time, you see that this avoidance of the Red Sea, because of the crisis in Yemen, the $2,000 drone versus the $2 million missile, as you put it, has led to ships diverting to the Cape of Good Hope, that is to say, to South Africa. Now, on the one hand, that could be a bonanza for the Pretoria-based regime, but I'm sure the comrades there are thinking of how they can leverage this for further gain, perhaps calling conferences with their counterparts in Yemen and Egypt with regard to how they can raise the prices on these North Atlantic shipping firms. At the same time, I should also say that the current unrest in South Africa, induced by the fact that former President Jacob Zuma has now broken with the ruling party, the African National Congress, is going to introduce a certain kind of unrest, particularly in his home province, KwaZulu-Natal, which abuts the Indian Ocean, where ships heading towards the Cape of Good Hope are within hailing distance of. Likewise, you see that Malaysia, that Southeast Asian nation that has a predominantly Muslim population, has just barred Israeli ships or ships headed to Israel from their waters. They abut the strategically sited Straits of Malacca, and that will induce further crisis for the Israeli economy. I dare say that their neighbors in Indonesia, the largest predominantly Islamic nation on planet Earth, will probably emulate their Malaysian brothers and sisters, which will present the further problems for the Israelis. And likewise, pay attention to the frame of pro-Zionist support in the United States of America, not only reflected on campuses, which we've received an earful about, but also increasingly reflected in the ruling elite. I'm speaking of Ian Bremmer, a major risk consultant with close ties to Wall Street, who has raised questions about the future viability of the U.S. relationship to Israel. He also raised the question that many of us have been asking, which is that if Israel is such a close ally of the United States, why was it that Prime Minister Netanyahu during the Obama years not only publicly condemned the nuclear agreement with Iran that U.S. imperialism saw as important strategically, but flew to Washington at the behest of the opposing Republicans and spoke to Congress denouncing that accord in no uncertain terms. And yet, this is supposedly the closest ally of U.S. imperialism. I think that we referred previously to a column in the Washington Post by the CIA stenographer de facto, speaking of David Ignatius, who spoke in similar sour terms about Israel and its relationship to the United States of America. And I should also say that it's quite curious, is it not, that with regard to these convoys that are being proposed to chaperone ships through the Red Sea, that the Saudis are not on the list. The only neighboring country that's on the list is Bahrain, which of course happens to house a major U.S. Facility. That is an indication of the unpopularity of this particular maneuver. And I should also say that this is going to have significant impact on oil prices and inflation because BP, formerly British Petroleum, has already announced that it will be seeking to circumvent the Red Sea in terms of bringing oil from that part of the world to Western Europe and particularly to Rotterdam in the Netherlands. They're already boycotting, speaking of the Western Europeans, Russian oil. And so one has to wonder, will this also lead to not only a spike in oil prices, but more dependence upon oil shipments from the United States of America? And that's not only to speak of inflation in terms of energy, also I should reference here liquefied natural gas, but also in terms of simple items, such as toys. If they're adding thousands of miles from Asia to Western European and North American markets by circumventing the Red Sea and sailing via the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, that means more oil being burned in these ships. And then I think it may even give more leverage to China, because China, as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, has built train tracks that rumble from eastern China, the manufacturing site of a good deal of the global economy, all the way to Western Europe. If ships are not able to go through the Suez Canal because of the crisis in Yemen, perhaps they will revert to these Chinese trains rumbling across the Eurasian continent. So we see that all in all, this is a major crisis for world imperialism. It will also expose, I should say, the fact that Abu Dhabi, part of the United Arab Emirates, has been playing a double game. On the one hand, a mouthing rhetoric against the Israeli occupiers, but at the same time, reportedly, supposedly, having a land corridor from the Emirates to Israel, easing pressure on the Zionist state, because, of course, they are not necessarily unhappy about Hamas, seen as dangerously close to the Muslim Brotherhood. They're not unhappy about them being battered. That will add to a crisis in the Emirates, a crisis in Abu Dhabi, and therefore magnifying the entire crisis of world imperialism.
TASS reports North Korea's Kim vows to respond unhesitatingly with nuclear strike if Pyongyang provoked. It seems that Biden and Blinken and the neocons are pretty much trying to find every crisis point they can in the world to set the things on fire. Your thoughts on what's going on with North Korea?
Well, I would warn and caution the White House and the hotheads in Washington to tread carefully. They might have seen that news report of a North Korean satellite, which took pictures of the White House itself, which suggests that if they can take a picture, they can do other things with regard to the White House being in the crosshairs. So I would warn them to steer clear of that crisis. I would also suggest a reading list for the hotheads in Washington. And they may want to start with the memoir written by former Congressional Black Caucus member Charlie Rangel of Harlem. I haven't had a bad day since, which talks about while he was a soldier during the ill-fated U.S. intervention on the Korean Peninsula, 1950 to 1953. And he saw what happened when Chinese comrades crossed the border into the Democratic People's Republic of Korea to help to sustain and fortify their comrades. And as he said, he thought that he was going to meet his maker. And if Washington is not careful, they will see a replay of what Mr. Rangel witnessed a half century ago or more. I would also say that this crisis in North Korea is also going to put enormous pressure on U.S. relations with South Korea. For example, President Yoon, a conservative, is losing popularity precipitously. There is a hunger in South Korea for return to the sunshine policy of Kim Dae-jung, the former leader, who about 23 odd years ago, on the 50th anniversary of the U.S. intervention in his homeland, flew to North Korea and we thought that had led to a kind of long-standing entente between the two Koreas. But of course, Washington was not satisfied with that. And of course, it's going to put enormous pressure on Japan, which is signed up, I'm afraid to say, for this lunatic U.S. policy of encircling the People's Republic of China. But there are unresolved grievances between many on the Korean Peninsula and Tokyo, given their brutal colonization of Korea from 1910 to about 1945. So Washington, once again, should tread carefully. The hotheads should be restrained because they have enough crises to deal with regard to Ukraine, with regard to Israel, Gaza, with regard to Yemen, with regard to Taiwan. They don't need another in North Korea.
And just in 30 to 45 seconds, it's not only North Korea, it's North Korea's allies, such as China and Russia, compared to America's allies, we'll say South Korea and Japan. I wouldn't want to be on the American ally side of this conflict if the United States provoked a response.
Well, being a U.S. ally, so-called, can be a very perilous venture, as I'm afraid to say President Zelensky is about to discover to his dismay.
What do they say? And I think this was attributable to Henry Kissinger. To be an American ally is dangerous. To be an American enemy is dangerous. To be an ally is fatal.
Indeed.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.